The title of this seminar is A Philosophy of the Ministry. Now that sounds a little bit high-flown in a way, but a philosophy is an analysis of the grounds and concepts expressing fundamental beliefs. How do we think about the ministry? What does the ministry mean to us? How does the ministry relate to the church? What are the grounds and concepts that express our fundamental belief relative to the ministry? Now, of the group of people sitting here before me, there is two ministers, I'm sorry. And there will at some time in the future maybe be one or two more out of this group. Maybe more than that, maybe less, but certainly not all of you by any stretch of the imagination will ever be ministers. Is it really necessary then for you to sit through this? I think it is. Because for a person who is an opinion leader in the church, or who is a pillar in the church, or who is going to have any element of leadership, be they male or female in the church, it's awfully important to know how we look at the ministry and how the ministry will relate to you as you serve Christ, and how you will relate to the ministry as minister as he serves Christ. So I think it's important that we all have an understanding and that we all, be speaking in kind of in the same terms, or be on the same wavelength at least when we talk about the ministry, and to understand how we think about it. Now, we bring with us to this study a lot of presuppositions about the ministry. There is, for example, the concept of clergy. Clergy is defined as the sacerdotal or religious or priestly class of a religion. And oddly enough, almost any way we look at the ministry, we tend to look upon them as a class. It may have its roots in some medieval class consciousness, I don't know. But we do tend to look upon the ministry as a class along the way. They are also defined as that body of men ordained to the service of God in the Christian church, or as the official or sacerdotal class of a religion. Now, can you think of some classes that we might put ministers in? What kind of class they might fall into? Anything come to your mind? Yeah. A righteous class? Our ministers over here are kind of grinning to themselves a little bit. Not feeling particularly any more righteous than anybody else, but people will. You are correct. That is a presupposition regarding a class that people would put the ministry in. What else? A leadership class, a class of leaders. Yeah. They are people who kind of set the pace, as it were. Do you think it's possible that people look upon the ministry as a poor class in any religion? Yeah. Yeah, they do. In fact, there are certain, like the Catholics, among the mendicant monks, they take a vow of poverty, and they begin to form a poor class in the church. And funnily enough, they don't necessarily fit in with the other poor in the church. They form a poor class all of their own. But there are those, and there is that hangover really that goes with that almost relates the ministry to, that causes people to feel upset or uncomfortable if a minister lives at a higher level than the poorer class does of the congregation. Does that exist anywhere in churches? Oh, yeah. It came as a shock to me. It was 8 years ago. In fact, and I should have known better, I guess, but it came as a shock to me. I'm a real estate agent in Austin, Texas, when I was buying my home down there. There was a very active Southern Baptist. And he attended the largest Southern Baptist church in Austin. The largest Southern Baptist church in Austin was the Hyde Park Baptist Church. And in 1978, the pastor of the Hyde Park Baptist Church in Austin, Texas, earned $60,000 per year, plus allowances for house, car, and so forth. It shocked me. But then I got to thinking about it. The man had a Ph.D. He had a very large church. There were 5 or 6 other ministers in his congregation. I'm not sure how many he had. Green Acres Baptist Church in Tyler, Texas has their pastor, their senior pastor, that's what they call him. And then they have a youth pastor, a young adults pastor, a minister of music, a minister of education. They have all these men. And now they don't all work just in their own field. All of them minister to the church in one way or another. But then you have your senior pastor. So this man who is in charge of this church has a very large staff. There are secretaries. There are office workers. There are people who are unordained who work in the church. They really have an organization. They have a family life center, which will blow your eyes out. I mean, it's a gorgeous place. It's got indoor running track, handball and racquetball courts, a game room for kids, a big game room for kids with pool tables and video games and all this type of thing. I don't believe they have an indoor swimming pool yet. They own land on the lake, where they can go out for picnics and so forth. A large lakeshore recreational area that all their members have access to. That's a pretty good club that you can when your donations are tax-free, and you don't even have to donate all that much. You think about that. There's a lot of benefits that go along with that. Mr. Phillips?
When we were down there, I used to buy gas from a man who attended there. He said they had 11 full-time ministers besides the senior pastor, 97 deacons.
11 full-time ministers at Green Acres?
Plus all these retired Baptist ministers put their letter in there.
Yeah.
They're used, but they're retired, so you can
right.
say 10.
But they're 10. They were 11 full-time ministers plus, and how many deacons?
97.
97
this
deacons.
man was a deacon.
Yeah. I'm amazed. I didn't realize they had that many. My wife sold a house to one of the ministers of that church, and he bought a $130,000 home, in Tyler, which is awfully good in Tyler. I don't know, it may not sound that big out here, but it is awfully good in Tyler. And a nice big place, beautiful, good neighborhood, underground utilities and all this type of stuff, and about 2,600 square feet, I would say, in the place. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, and all that good stuff. So, and this wasn't the pastor. This was I think this was the minister for young adults. I think they may even have a minister for singles in that church, judging the number they've got. It's impressive. And what was really impressive to me and struck me is the fact that the idea, amongst other Baptists, the idea of the ministry as a poor class seems to be fading somewhat. But, when you get out in country churches, though, and I think even you'll find many people who are Baptists nowadays who might think of joining Green Acres Baptist Church would not like it there because they think their minister ought to be poor. That's one concept of the ministry. There's class consciousness, though, available in just about any way you look at it. For example, people look upon the ministry as an office to be held, and therefore they look upon a minister as an officer as opposed to an enlisted man. They would think in terms of deacons as non-commissioned officers, corporals and sergeants, and sometimes with the attitudes that go along with that, those particular ranks, or that are associated with those ranks. Some ministers are like second lieutenants, shavetails, and with the attitude that goes along with that. There is this kind of class consciousness again that gets involved. Is that what we're going to find in here, in the book? Now we get into another matter entirely, and we are going to talk about that. There is a question also, how there are other presuppositions that we have when we take a look at the ministry. One, we look upon the ministry as a calling. Many people do not look upon it as a calling. They look upon it more as a vocation, a profession, something you choose to do, and something you go into. But we look upon it, as I said, as a calling. There are people who see the minister as governor. Close to what you said earlier about minister as leader. But he is perceived as a governor. Then there is the other question, minister, the alternative, really, and there are churches who look at this both ways. One, minister as governor, and secondly, minister as employee. Any of you know of a church denomination that looks upon their minister as an employee? You do? Mm-hmm. What denominations? United Methodist. I see. Yes? Church of God Seventh. Oh, really? I didn't really quite know that. They look upon him as an employee. They hire him? Definitely. I see. Okay. The Church of Christ does. In fact, the Baptists, when they have a meeting to get a new pastor, they put together a pulpit committee and they talk in terms of calling the minister to their church. The Church of Christ get together and they talk about hiring a new pastor. They are both doing the same thing. The Church of Christ is honest about their terminology. Although the Baptists, in all fairness, do believe that God expresses His will through the collective votes and so forth of the congregation. The congregation elects a pulpit committee. The pulpit committee does most of the work. When they present a candidate, they are pretty sure that he's what the local church is going to want, or they would not bring him down there. Sometimes they may give them an alternative of 3 or 4 who they bring down over time to preach to the church, but by the time they get down to a vote, they have gotten most of the work done for the people so they don't have to go wondering about it. There are a lot of problems, of course, that come about in any of these concepts of the way we deal with the ministry. In the Worldwide Church of God, we had a pretty good experience, a pretty thorough experience. I don't know how good it was, with the minister as governor, the concept that he basically ran the show and was an autocratic ruler of whatever went on in his church, subject only really to another autocratic ruler who was above him, who was subject to only one other autocratic ruler, and that was the pastor general of the church. And so you have an autocracy, that sort of a government from the top down, but that the only awareness you have of the movers and shakers come in a human line of authority through the church. It has its problems, which I don't think I need to go into here. Minister as employee could also present us with some problems, couldn't it? Tell me a couple.
If he's presenting a view or something else that everybody doesn't like.
Yeah. There is, of course, that subliminal or very slight pressure on his preaching that goes on there, which no matter how courageous he is, it's there. It sort of sits right back here, you know, and kind of works on him all the time. Yes, sir.
I know in the Church of God today, the minister is always subject to the local church board.
Yeah.
And their thoughts as far as the way he should conduct his ministry, especially toward evangelism and things like that. If they don't particularly care for evangelism or anything like that, that's biblically supported, they can put the screws to the pastor as an employee and threaten him.
Yeah. Now, the one thing that you will learn when you get down to the intra-church relations tape, where I discuss this at some little length, is that the pastor who ignores the power structure in his church, no matter what that church does, is doing it at his peril. Even in the Catholic Church, even in the worldwide Church of God. You know, the pastor that ignores the power structure in his local church, where the lines of influence run among those people, is doing so at his peril. That, you know, and I think that probably, you know, Mr. Phillips would probably be aware of this to some extent, because there are, you know, you kind of assume, you'd like to assume if you're in an autocratic organization like that, that you have basically handled politics. But you got all the politics into a can and the lid is on it and it's all under control. No way. No way. It is always there. So it's not altogether bad that a minister needs to look over his shoulders a little bit, at the people in the church, what they're thinking, at the you know, a local church board or council is not necessarily in itself bad, is it? Because in one sense of the word, you know, he could also be wrong. And the fact that, let's say, a half a dozen mature, Spirit-led men in the congregation come to him together and say, we think you are wrong, I would certainly, if they did that to me, I'd want to sit down and say, well, let's talk about this. Because, you know, after all, I'm not the only person here who has God's Spirit. But at the same token, if they are paying him a salary, does that distort the relationship? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. There is absolutely no doubt about it. In other words, the minister ought to be consulting leaders in his congregation about decisions that he makes. People in the congregation ought to know what's going on. The sharing ought to take place. But if the congregation has power over the minister, all of a sudden the lines of communication have gotten distorted. If the minister is lording it over the congregation, all these lines have been distorted. And bad things can start to happen in any church. I don't care what it is. I don't care what its organizational structure is along the way. Now, it would behoove us then, if we're going to understand this rather curious relationship that exists in a church between pastor and lay person, even between pastor and widow, between pastor and deacon, between pastor and choir director, or pastor and whoever, then I think we might do well, mightn't we, to spend just a little bit of time analyzing the origins of the ministry, where it came from, and what we can learn from the Bible about, let's say, as I put it earlier, a philosophy of the ministry, which is just simply how we think about it, how we view it, how it sits in the church. Now, I want to talk first of all today, we're going to start off back in the 6th chapter of Luke with the origins of the ministry. Now, when I mentioned I was going to talk about the origins of the ministry, Mr. Phillips asked me, well, what do you mean? At what point are you going to start on the origins of the ministry? Where do you mean? And basically what I mean is the starting point for the ministry of Jesus Christ. For in one sense of the word, every priest that ever served in the temple was a minister. John the Baptist was a minister. The word minister just simply means servant. Basically, I'm talking about the origins of the ministry of Jesus Christ. In Luke 6 and verse 13, or verse 12, it came to pass in those days that he went out into a mountain to pray, and he continued all night in prayer toward God. And when it was day, he called unto him his disciples, and of them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. Now during this session today, I'm going to want your participation along the way, because what we're looking for is what can we learn from these very simple statements that are placed here. For Luke and John and Paul did not anticipate our problems, our questions, and the things that we would like to know. But nevertheless, the information is there if we have the wit to see it. There are a number of things that we can conclude. There are a number of derivatives, as it were, things we can derive, implications that we can arrive at based upon some of the plain statements that are made here. Okay? He says to us, and when it was day, he called to him his disciples, and of them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. What do you get from that? What additional pieces of information, other than what's stated here, can you pick up? Yes, sir.
There must have been much more than 12, or at least 2 or 3 more.
Had to be 13, didn't there?
At least.
You know, because he chose 12 out of a larger group. And in fact, there were quite a lot number more than that. How many more, we're not sure. We know that at the day of Pentecost, or about that time, that the church was only about 120 in number. But there was a time when it was much larger than that. But there was a point where a lot of them fell away, and guess how many of them fell away when he was crucified? Do you suppose there was a great loss of disciples when Jesus was crucified? You bet there were. Yes, sir. He must have what?
Really prayed on it.
Oh yeah, he spent all night. At the last, the last moments before he decided, he spent the whole night in prayer. Yes, sir?
That's what I was going to talk about. It was a decision, because he was laying the foundation. These men would be laying the foundation for the church from then on, so it had to be a decision to select the right men for that position.
Okay, now let me put this question to you a slightly different angle, and you'll come back to the same answer. With whom did Jesus consult in naming the apostles? God. With whom did he not consult? Anybody else. Which included the disciples. Now, I don't want to rub this in or try to make some big point out of it, out of the thing. But I think it's worth pausing for a moment to realize this. These men were not elected by from the disciples. He hand-picked every one of them himself. Why? What do we learn from this? Why do you think he did that? What do you think that means to you? Yes, sir?
He knew their heart, and he knew what they would do.
Right. He knew them, of course, better than anyone else could possibly know them. That's quite certain. There may be more than that. What else do you think there might be to it?
Didn't he also have to know the heart of the one that was betrayed so that he could include him in the number?
Yeah. He also knew the heart of Judas. You think in terms, of qualifications. Who was qualified? And you would think that he knew Judas wasn't. And he did. Picked him anyway. Or it may be that Judas was qualified in every way, but that he knew that he would change. He knew that he would go a different direction. He knew he would decide. He saw the flaw that was in him, even though all the superficial qualifications were there. Hard to say all of that, isn't it? There are a lot of what-ifs and so forth, but still it's fascinating to realize. He chose them, handpicked, every one of them. Do you think the fact that he saw in them certain characteristics that might suit them for the different things he might be wanting them to do? Yeah, he was able to know those things. Do you think it may have even had to do at all with who he wanted to work with? Yeah, I think it might have. In fact, we have this thing of not being respecters of persons so much in our minds that we can sometimes forget the fact that Jesus had one of those disciples that he particularly loved, that was, in a sense, a favorite. His name was John. And that there are people who do relate to one another better than they relate to other people. And so he wanted a group with whom he could work and with whom he would be comfortable. I mean, unless he particularly was the kind of person that wanted to wear a hair shirt, in which case he could select an apostle who would be a thorn in his side, a burr under the saddle, who, although he was a good man, would cause him all kinds of difficulties. May have gotten close to that in Peter, but even though Peter was a man who caused him certain discomfort and abilities, he was a man he still loved very much. And there seems to have been, see, this is a very significant thing, that there was a difference in the way Jesus loved each one of these men. He loved them all at the level at which, let's say, we're all required to love our fellow man. But he didn't love them all the same. There were those whom he loved more. And that didn't seem to pose a problem for anybody, except perhaps for Judas. They all seemed to have accepted that. I almost get the impression that John was a little bit embarrassed by it. For instead of using his own name, he says, that disciple whom Jesus loved, or that disciple who leaned upon his breast asked him, rather than saying, well, I asked him, or I was the one, or I was his favorite. John does not refer to himself that way, but you do pick that up, nevertheless, in what he says. So, here we have the origins of the ministry. They are all specifically chosen, designated by Jesus Christ himself, after spending the whole night in prayer with the Father. And we can kind of pick up on, like as I said, a few things about these men. We know, of course, that one of them later became disqualified, or actually died, and was replaced. Otherwise, it would seem, wouldn't it, that the office of apostle was a permanent office. That the church was kind of stuck with them being apostles once they got to be apostles. There's no hint here of anything else taking place except because of the one who died and otherwise disqualified himself. And Peter, of course, comes to the place where that replacement must take place. But before we go on, let's turn over to Matthew, the 10th chapter, because this is what, in broadest sense of the word, is the Apostles' Commission. Now, I know the Great Commission, but this is the Apostles' Commission, that he gave to these 12 men in particular. When he had called them unto him, chapter 10 of Matthew, verse 1, when he had called unto him his 12 apostles, he gave them power against unclean spirits to cast them out, and heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. The names of the apostles are these, and he names them all for us. Verse 5, these 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, don't go into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans don't enter. But go ye to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of God, or kingdom of heaven, is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Provide neither gold, nor silver, nor brass in your purses, nor scrip, that's paper money, for your journey, neither 2 coats, nor shoes, nor yet staves, for the workman is worthy of his meat. What do you pick up from that? Now here's a man going out, got one staff in his hand. He's got the clothes he has on his back. He has no money, not even a change of clothes. Oh yeah, oh yeah. In God. And in Jesus. And his work. Yeah. What he was going to be doing was going to bear fruit, Had to be. Yeah.
Ministering under Christ means not making a huge, gigantic profit.
Yeah. He's not making a huge, gigantic profit, but there's another side to that coin if you thought about it.
The quality of his ministry depended on his survival.
I suppose so. Yeah.
Also, how can you bring the purity of the ministry and also bring money or serve it in any way?
How can you bring the purity of the ministry and also bring money? Well, you see, Paul kind of did that in a way. And that Paul went into a city and never took a dime off anybody. But what he says here, he says, the laborer is worthy of his meat.
I think he should get paid.
Well, he should be supported. In other words, this fellow comes wandering into your community, maybe knocks on your door to stay in your home. What are you going to have to do? Well, you're going to have to feed him, give him a place to sleep. What are you going to do if his shoes wears out while he's staying with you? Going to give him another pair. What are you going to do if he needs a coat because it gets cold? you're going to give him yours, right? If you're the person there, you're going to be expected to take care of his physical needs. That's all right there. You know, isn't it? Yes, sir.
I think it illustrates it when Christ said the master would not, the master would serve the servant in that both ways. It seems to illustrate an attitude of humility in service, righteous type of attitude.
It does. But again, one of the things that the man's up against here, and that you're up against if he comes to your door, you got to support him and support his ministry. Yes, sir.
Well, that's what I don't
Yeah.
muzzle the ox.
Yeah, right. Paul makes that point later on when he points out to the Corinthians that he never did any of this. No, he did not expect them to just take care of him. He worked with his own hands, I'll mind you. But also, what he doesn't bother mentioning to the Corinthians is that the Philippians very nearly supported his ministry while he was there. In other words, he did have money coming to him from outside. And mind you, this is not all that Jesus has to say to the apostles on this subject. This is what takes place on this commission at this moment for this particular journey, as we will see later in the study. Were you asking a question or just stretching your arm? Okay. Yes?
Well, also another concept. He gave them power, and
Yes.
power they were impressive.
They gave power. They were able to heal the sick. I dare say if I walked in and cleansed a leper, I could count on that old boy to take me into his house. I would have to conclude that he would probably do that for me. In fact, I don't think I would have any problem getting enough to eat. You know, if I healed anybody like that, a blind person, a leper, they would be very anxious to be helpful to me in doing the ministry that I might do. And of course, later he will tell them not to go from house to house another time. But anyway, he says, wherever you go, whatever town, you inquire who in it is worthy, and you abide there until you leave. And when you come into a house, salute it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. If it be not worthy, let your peace come back to you. And that's all. That would provoke a lot of curiosity, but it's really not along the lines of our inquiry, so we're going to pass over that for today. He says finally in verse 16, Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. I want you to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. In my ministry, I've sometimes found myself as wise as a dove and as harmless as a serpent, but I didn't mean to be. You know, that has happened to me from time to time. But this is a part of what an apostle is supposed to be and to do. He is to be wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove. And to any of you who will ever engage in Christian service, be it a minister or a lay person, deacon or what have you, for those of you who will find yourself in Christian service, I think the old maxim that, does it come from medical science or from, I think it comes from medical science. First of all, do no harm. You know, whatever else it is that you're going to do, be certain that you do no harm. Now, this is something which I think that I wish I could have gotten a little clearer in my mind before I set out into the ministry. Because being an idealist by nature, as I am, and not realizing sometimes that ideas are like loaded shotguns and you need to be very careful with them, I think that I hurt some people. In fact, I'm quite sure that I did along the way in ways that they did not need to be hurt and in ways that they did not really have the faith to deal with it. In the sense that people who really did not have the faith to stop working on the Sabbath did and suffered considerable loss in their homes and their family as a result of having done that. And I would have been much wiser, frankly, had I taken my mind and said, okay, first of all, I don't want to be sure that I do not harm these people. Therefore, I need to be cautious in my counsel. I need to be careful in my advice. I need to present the Word of God faithfully, yes. But I need not go beyond this in urging this man to quit his job or demanding that he quit his job. That is his decision. It involves his faith before his God, not mine. So bear that in mind and write that down for your future reference and your motto if you're ever going in the service of God. First of all, do no harm. Jesus said, be harmless as a dove and as wise as a serpent. Beware of men, though. They'll deliver you up into the councils. They will scourge you in their synagogues, and you shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake and a testimony against them and the Gentiles. Trust no man. You know, it's just another way of saying it. You trust God. You just don't put your trust in people. He said, you shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, a testimony against them and the Gentile. When they deliver you up, take no thought how or what you shall speak, for it shall be given you in that same hour what you shall speak. It is not you that speak, it is the Spirit of your Father which speaks in you. Most Christians will never experience this in all their lives. This statement was made to the apostles as a part of an apostles' commission, and that the apostle, because of what he was doing, was certain to be brought before magistrates, before governors, before people in authority who could do him no end of harm. His responsibility is a little different from, let's say, the lay member of the church, the widow, the fatherless, the poor fellow that's struggling just to keep his family fed and has no leadership responsibilities in the church. He's not going to be brought before kings and before governors. Governors and kings have no time for working people. That's not what it's talking about. This is talking about leadership in the church who are so effective that they do pose a threat to civil government, civil order, and what have you. To these people is this promise given. Don't worry about what you have to say. When you are there, I will speak through you in that moment of time. Not that it wouldn't happen to you, and not that if you find yourself in that circumstance, you cannot claim that witness, that blessing. But it is not spoken initially to you. He said, when they deliver you up, don't think about this. God will help you. It is not you that speak. It's the Spirit of your Father that speaks in you. Brother shall deliver up brother to death, the father the child. Children shall rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. And you shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. He that endures to the end shall be saved. When they persecute you in this city, flee to another. Verily I say unto you, you shall not have gone over the cities of Israel until the Son of Man be come. And that's an interesting expression. For it obviously then has to mean that this work being done by these men would outlive them. That it would go well beyond their generation, for, they naturally did not go over all the cities of Israel. They never finished it. And indeed, I don't think, anybody else has ever finished it. Obviously, they haven't. For Jesus said, before you really get through with that, the Son of Man will become. The disciple is not above his master, nor the servant above his Lord. It is enough for the disciple that he be as his master, and the servant as his Lord. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more shall they call them of his household? Don't fear them. There is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, nothing hid that shall not be known. What I tell you in darkness, you speak in light. What you hear in the ear, preach it on the housetops. And don't fear them that kill the body and are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. For a person who takes this commission in hand and walks out to preach the gospel, that warning about don't be afraid of human beings who can kill you. You'd better be afraid of me, is what he's saying. Don't be afraid of them. Be afraid of me. And the fear of God is something that every minister needs to have, every servant of God, as far as not minister otherwise, needs to have right up in front of his eyes at all times. The love of God is a wonderful thing, but don't ever lose your fear of him. Because in one sense of the word, fearing him more than you fear men is where that strength comes from. The awareness that he's there, and he's made his promises, and he will help you. He says 2 sparrows are sold for a farthing, and one of them falls on the ground without your Father knowing it. And the very hairs of your head are numbered. Now you don't have to worry then whether God knows where you are when you're out doing his work. If he knows how many hairs you got on your head, and every time you leave a few of them in a wash basin, the calculation is made and it's all known, then don't worry about the fact that God knows you're in jail for his name's sake. Don't worry about it. He knows where you are. At least he knows where your hair is. Don't worry about it, he said. You are more valuable than many sparrows. Whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, him will I confess before my Father which is in heaven. Whosoever shall deny me before men, him will I deny before my Father which is in heaven. Now this is very meaningful, I'm sure, to every one of us. But you have to think of it in its context. As it's spoken to a group of men who are going to receive power over unclean spirits, over diseases, power to preach, to convert, to baptize, in whom is the Holy Spirit, who has spent all his time with Jesus Christ. They deny him, he says, and I will deny you before my Father which is in heaven. Peter did, of course, but Peter was forgiven for it. So you can be forgiven of that. But on the other hand, the sobering thing of this, and the thing one should never forget, is that no matter what kind of circumstance you find yourself in as a servant of God. Here's something I don't know if you understand fully. Here you are, let's say you're a working staff, you got a job, you go work at 9 to 5, and you go home and take care of your family and so forth, and you deny Christ in some kind of situation that you find yourself in. Who have you hurt? Yourself. You're a preacher, and you preach to people week in, week out, and you deny Christ. Who do you hurt? Not just yourself anymore, is it? Do you think maybe God might be justified in telling these gentlemen, you'd better fear me more than you fear civil authorities? And you'd better be more afraid to deny me than you are afraid of what they're going to do to you? I think so. There is a tremendous burden that comes on the shoulders of anyone who puts his hand to the plow of the service of God. Now, it's bad enough for any person who has put his hand to the plow as a Christian to look back. It is fatal for a minister who puts his hand to the plow to look back. So, think about that. And not, whatever degree, and I say minister, when I'm using minister here, you need to understand that I'm using it in a dual sense. On the one hand, there is the ordained minister, of which there are 3 of us here in this room. On the other hand, there are the unordained or lay ministers in the church, of which we've got a whole bunch of them here. Because the sense of ministry, the word minister just means serve. That's all it means. And a minister is a servant. And anyone who serves is a minister of God's people. And I have been ministered to in my lifetime, in my time in God's church, by a lot of people who never received any recognition for it, were never known, and in fact the service that they did to me was probably never known by anybody but me and God. But it was there, and there was a ministry that was provided, and Paul refers to it, of people who ministered to him in his times of need, in his work. And these people are ministers, not just ministering to the ministry, but ministering to one another. The person who takes the time to spend time with people who are lonely is very much a minister, not recognized by anyone but God and the person to whom he or she is ministering. He says, don't think I'm come to send peace on earth. I'm not come to send peace but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, the daughter against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's foes shall be they of his own household. I've been blessed a little bit myself in the fact that I have not got an enemy anywhere in my family from the church. But I do not believe that I am anywhere near as close to my family as I would have been if I were not in the church. The service of God has taken me physically away from my family, has taken away a lot of things that we have in common, and a lot of the closeness that we might have had when younger days is no longer there. And occasionally I have a certain amount of regret over it, but there really is not just a whole lot I can do about it. And my family seems to have accepted it. We still love each other, and we see one another. But the closeness that could have been there is not there. Part of it is my fault, and part of it is the ministry's fault. The fault of being what I am, which has taken me away from my family. And this is what Jesus is saying. Not only is there the possibility of just being away from, there's the possibility of making enemies within your own family. And in fact, probably the more effectively you serve God, the more likely that is to happen. Not just from the travel, but from what you live and what you say and what you stand for. He that loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He that loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Does this make any difference to you now that you see this in context where it's coming from? That this is spoken particularly to 12 men who are going to be full-time in the service of God, many of whom would not darken the doors, around their family ever again, maybe in their lifetime, or who at least wouldn't see them but once in a blue moon because, you can jump on an airplane. Mr. Phillips could jump on an airplane, go back to Alabama if he had family to visit there, and be there in a few hours. But back in these times, where some of these men were going to be, they might be 5 years, 10 years, and maybe never seeing their own families again. He that takes not his cross, his burden, whatever it happens to be, and follows not after me is not worthy of me. He that finds his life shall lose it, and he that loses his life for my sake shall find it. This is basically talking about the responsibilities of the service of God, that we actually have to lose our life and give up to some extent our life, our wants, our desires, what we're going to do if we're going to be effective in the service of God. And the more deeply involved we are in the service of God, the more this is true. The more active we are, the more responsible we are, the more visible we are, the more this is true. You seek your own life, you look after your things, you're going to lose it. If you give up your life and seek the things of God, you will gain it. It is true in a sense of every Christian, but it is spoken in this context to the ministry, the beginning of the ministry of Jesus Christ. He that receives you receives me, and he that receives me receives him that sent me. Now, what does that tell you about the ministry? Anything? I see some heads nodding, and it's so obvious, isn't it? You know.
Christ is there.
Pardon?
It's as if Christ
was there. Now, does that mean that I can exercise some kind of superhuman authority over you because I am here and as though I were Christ? Well, if I'm acting like Christ, you haven't a thing to fear. What if I'm not? You don't do it. You know, it's just simply that. You don't obey me if I'm telling you to do something that is wrong. But the point simply is that here comes one, you know, if John was here, or Peter, or the others, we wouldn't have any trouble receiving them as we would receive Christ, would we? But in a sense, every minister that Christ sends is in that category. And it's important that we understand that. Now, and he says, he that receives me receives him that sent me. So it's a matter of receiving God. Now, it doesn't mean a minister is God to you, or a leader in the church is God to you, not by any stretch of the imagination. It is one of the things that a lot of husbands who try to use Ephesians 5 to dominate their wives forget. You know, you're supposed to obey me as the church obeys Christ. But she has a right to have him love her as Christ loved the church. And no man can claim that kind of response from his wife who is not showing that kind of an attitude to his wife. And as a minister, I can expect your support. I can expect your help. I can expect your obedience in those areas where it's appropriate, only when I am acting toward you as Christ would act toward the church. So it's a complicated little situation, isn't it? With a lot of ifs and ands and buts and things we wonder about. But it's pretty evident here when you look at it that the ministry are in a very responsible position in the church. There's a very heavy burden upon a minister's shoulders when people are told that you're supposed to receive that minister as you would receive Christ. Now he goes on then to say, he that receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. Complicated little thing again. Basically he means if you just acknowledge he's a prophet, and he's come to you as a prophet, and you say, yeah, he is a prophet, and you treat him like a prophet, he says you're going to receive a prophet's reward. If you treat him like something else, that's a different matter altogether. So I would have to conclude then that the man who received an apostle in the name of an apostle, as though he were an apostle, would receive that kind of reward. He that receives a minister, you know, a deacon, whatever it may be that God has sent to do some service, as what he is, recognizes him for what he is going to be blessed in that regard for it. So, that's what we do. Oh my, we lost some of my notes behind me here. I'm glad I have somebody to pick them up for me. Get lost here in the process of everything. Okay, now what have we learned? You know, what have we derived here? Yes, sir. Yeah, the ministry is a total commitment. How do you derive that, though? How do you arrive at that from what we have read here?
First chapter of Matthew 10 there, that's exactly what Christ told us.
Yeah. He said they had to be committed to what it was that they were going to be doing here. But certainly was true. What else do you derive from? Yes, sir.
It's a two-way street.
Yeah.
Everybody has to go by the same rules and treat each other pretty much equally. You have to show respect for everybody.
Yes.
Not just an authority as a lesser person.
Okay. What else do you pick up from all this? Anything in particular? Yeah.
The relationship between you and God, and how that communication goes, and what type of attitude and instructability you want to show to the people you're teaching, to the people around you, that how it affects you as a Christian servant, per se.
Yes, sir.
You have to be very careful in your decisions as a minister. Make sure that they're decisions that God would have you make for them, so that you don't hurt anybody. Be very careful.
Absolutely. The minister has to be very careful in the decisions he makes, to be very careful, of course, of not causing any harm. And the other side of the coin is That when a minister is operating that way, what are your obligations as a non-minister?
Support him as you would Christ.
That's right, to support him. And, give him your support and give him your help and the benefit of any doubt. And we'll come to that a little bit more as we go along. Yes, Ruth?
And it seems, well, it is, that he that receives you receives me. Now, Christ was putting that on them. They were not asking for that. They were not
That's correct.
taking that upon themselves. And the ministers can't take that upon themselves. It's something that's given to them.
Okay, yeah, that was given to them. They didn't decide to be apostles. They were called, selected, handpicked, called away from what they were doing. He told them, drop what you're doing and come and follow me. One young man says, let me go bury my dead. He says, let the dead bury the dead. You follow me. He wanted them, just like Peter knows, they dropped their nets and they walked off down the road after him to wherever he was going. That is a sobering thing to really think of. But then again, we are dealing with Jesus Christ and the calling that he has for these people. So kind of summarizing that the ministry is in its origins was a calling. That it was people who were selected and chosen by Jesus Christ, not by vote or by congregational appeal or by the people all agreeing that this was a good thing to do. He handpicked them by himself, and for the work that he wanted to do. He commissioned them then to that work and sent them out to carry on that work. Continuing on now in Luke, the 10th chapter, we have another category of people. This is still a part of the origins of the ministry, although these people were not ordained and never were, for the most part, as far as we know. In the 10th chapter of the book of Luke, and we'll begin reading in verse 1. He said, after these things, the Lord appointed other 70 also. And he sent them 2 and 2 before his face into every city and place where he himself would come. These people went ahead of him. They're kind of like an advance man, as he worked his way across the countryside. I gather they were in a town for quite a long time before Jesus actually came on the scene, and therefore assured that there would be quite a number of people there to hear him when he actually walked into town. Therefore he said to them, the harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Pray you, therefore, the Lord of the harvest, that he would send forth laborers into his harvest. Now, what does this add to our knowledge so far of a philosophy or an understanding of the ministry than what we might have had before? What, can you pick up anything from here? Just 2 quick verses. Don't look for anything real complicated. Yeah?
Ministers, they need help.
Yeah. Let me put it to you this way. There will always, at all times in the church, be more work to do than there will be people to do it. Always. There will always be more in terms of ministering to people's needs, be they spiritual, be they physical, be they whatever, than there will be ministers, certainly, to care for those needs. There was more preaching to be done than there were apostles to do it. There was more in the way of work to be done and going out and contacting people before Jesus went into a city than there were people to do it. And he says, you've got to go 70 people, 2 by 2, so they would be together, so they could buttress one another. And where one might lack, the other might add. And where one could know and lead, the other might be trained, so that he later could take someone else and go in another direction. That's what the 2 by 2 concept is all about. It is about training and developing other people as well as the reinforcement that 2 people have. Yeah?
So would you equate this then with discipleship rather than apostleship?
Discipleship rather than apostleship. I suppose so. Depending, we'd have to be defining terms. But these people were lay people, as far as we know. There's no indication that anything other than this was the case. And they were sent forth on a spiritual mission. Yes, sir?
Well, in verse 4, it seems to indicate they were being paid to do this job. And can lay people be paid?
Well, let's continue on just and read what you're saying. Go your way. I send you forth as lambs among wolves. Carry neither purse, nor scrip, nor shoes, and salute no man by the way. Into whatsoever house you enter, first say, peace be to this house. And, same thing he told the apostles. So that consequently, here were some more people sent out without any money. And they were expected, wherever they went, to be fed and housed and clothed. They weren't going to get rich on this. We all understand that. Because there's no indication they were given that much money from any of the people they stayed with at all, although perhaps they were, because they carried no gold with them at all. But they were fed and they were housed and they were clothed wherever they went. So, paid? Yeah, the laborer is worthy of his hire. Now, there's another thing here that you have to think about. These people were sent. They were selected, and they were sent. Were they self-appointed? No. Were they elected? Not a hint of it. Not a hint of it. Jesus picked every one of them out. Now, you may be aware of the fact that in the Church of God International, we have not required in all cases that there be a minister to baptize a person. But we have required that anybody who does baptize be designated by a minister to do so. In other words, no one should take it upon himself, irrespective of anything else, that they should baptize. It's based upon this principle that, people don't self-appoint themselves to the ministry. Now, that doesn't mean that personal evangelism in the sense of talking to people about the truth, about saying, here's a booklet to read on that subject if you'd like to, or saying, asking a person like the Ethiopian eunuch did, do you understand what you're reading? One of our members did that once. He was walking through a bank and he saw a lady sitting by a door waiting in the office, and she was reading the Bible. He walked through the door and said, what am I doing? Turned around, walked back and sat down by her and said, do you understand what you're reading? Awkward question, it seemed, in a way. They opened up about a 2-hour discussion with that lady. Don't know whatever became of it, but that's what personal evangelism is involved about. It's not appointing yourself as a preacher and running ads in the paper and trying to do mass evangelism in your local area. It is personal, one-on-one, nose to nose, as it were, eyeball to eyeball evangelism. That anybody can do at any time. But this type of thing, which is any kind of official work, the person needs to be appointed. If they may be designated and sent to do what they're doing, whether they are ordained or whether they are not self-appointed. And yes, they can be supported in what they're doing and should be supported in what they're doing if they're full-time in it and actually out there doing it. It doesn't mean, of course, if somebody's working in his own job and living at home in his own house with his own kids around him and his own cupboard full of food, that he should be taking food off of somebody else for serving in a local area. That's not what was happening here, obviously, is it? Whatever house you enter, say, peace be to this house. If the Son of Peace be there, your peace shall rest upon it. If not, it shall return to you again. In the same house remain, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his hire. Don't go from house to house. Don't bounce all over the place. When you get somewhere, stay put. And in whatsoever city you enter and receive you, eat what is set before you. Don't be critical or grousing or complaining or demanding. Eat what they give you. Heal the sick that are therein, and say to them, the kingdom of God is come unto you. If they don't receive you, well, you get up and leave them, of course. Now in verse 17, the 70 returned again with joy, saying, Lord, even the devils are subject to us through your name. And he said to them, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions and over the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. Notwithstanding in this, don't rejoice that the spirits are subject to you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. What do you get from that?
You shouldn't really revel in the power that you have, rather that God has chosen you.
Don't revel in the power that you have, but rejoice not merely that God has chosen you to be, let's say, a minister or a preacher or a healer. Rejoice that your name is written in heaven. Why? What does that mean? What does that say to you personally? Well, I'll tell you what... Huh?
I'm saved.
Yeah.
It's more important what's going to come rather than what's right now.
Yeah. I'll tell you what it says to me. It says, don't get cocky. Because you're good at what you do, or because, you heal somebody. Who healed them? You sure I didn't heal them. Here I am. I happen to be, too many pounds of human flesh and blood. And I wander into your town because Jesus Christ sent me here. And I put my hand on you because Jesus Christ told me to do it. And all of a sudden, you who were blind can now see. I'm supposed to get cocky? It's the funniest thing, though, over the years. Oftentimes, one of the worst things that can happen to some people is to experience, either as the purveyor of it, or that is the conveyor of a miracle, or the receiver of a miracle. And I've encountered people. I remember meeting one lady who had terminal cancer at one time in her life, and it was a real tragic situation. I think it was liver, and she was on her way. I mean, they had this time to make preparation for her to meet her Maker and to be buried. And a miracle took place. I don't remember all the details, but she was divinely and miraculously healed of that cancer. And the doctors were all standing there with their mouths hanging open and their hands up in the air saying, I don't know what happened. You know, it's a miracle. It's a miracle. By the time I visited this lady, and she had written in asking some questions about some of our literature, I sat down and I would try to explain something to her, and I couldn't teach her. She had written in asking some questions about some of our literature. I sat down and I would try to explain something to her, and I couldn't teach her.